fantastically, because I've been saying before, well, if you have this many people who are no longer in the workforce and no longer looking for work, well, you have to really include them in the unemployment rolls because they're not working when they could be and should be. You take into account the loss of available jobs, and you bring the number of jobs back to a level that it was before the recession hit. And you start to combine all those numbers, and you can start to see that there's a massive destruction and downsizing of the U.S. economy as far as jobs are concerned. And the only place that there has really been any positive growth as far as employment and in job growth is concerned is in the federal government. But here's how David Stockman breaks it down. At the present time, there are 210 million adult Americans between the ages of 16 and 68. Now, notice how that age is 68, not 65. See, you people think that, you're going to get your Social Security and retire, but they just push the age of retirement to 68, which is why it's included here. And 16, obviously, is the earliest or youngest in most states that you can work, even part-time, let alone full-time, without being like, on a farm or a paper boy or something like that. But, at 16, you can really pull in full-time hours, especially if you're not in school. So, at present, there are 200 million adult Americans between the ages of 16 and 68. Now, to take a plausible measure of potential work in this workforce, this is what you do. You take the number of hours that this labor force could potentially work in a year. So that 210 million between the ages of 16 and 68, that amounts to about 420 billion potential labor hours worked. Production. Any kind of production, producing something, producing a service, producing a product, doesn't matter, producing something. Now, if we accept the convention that all adults are at least theoretically capable of holding a full-time job, 2,000 hours per year, that's all it is for a full-time job, and pulling their share of society's need for production and work effort on 2,000 hours per year, by contrast, during the 2014 year, only 240 billion hours were actually supplied to the U.S. economy. In other words, only 240 billion hours were actually worked from that 210 million adult workforce, and that is out of a potential 420 billion hours, labor hours. All we got was 240 billion labor hours when we could have gotten 420 billion. So that estimate means that there were 180 billion unemployed labor hours. In other words, there should have been a potential for another 180 billion hours worked. So 180 billion hours worked would have pumped billions, hundreds of billions of dollars more into the U.S. economy. Understand? Now, you're probably saying, well, that's the same thing with unemployment, right? No. Out of the working pool. That money comes from the working pool. Those who are from, let's put it this way. When you pay somebody who isn't working money, where is that money coming from? That money is coming from the labor pool of those actually working the labor hours. So those who are working the labor hours aren't getting the full benefit of their salaries and wages because it is being taken out of the market, washed in government, where some of it is lost through government inadequacy basically, and government salary, and then a little bit is given back to the economy via unemployment insurance payments. So if a person pays, let's just say, let's use round numbers, in an annual sense, pays $1,000 into the unemployment insurance. Well, actually what gets paid out is a lot less than that. So about $300 worth. Now, these aren't my numbers. These are actually government numbers. So where is that other $700? It went poof, gone. So now we're taking a number of hours out of the current labor force to give to those who are not producing, who could be producing. And we're not giving them nearly as much as they could have been producing if they were at work. So technically, there were 180 billion unemployed labor hours, meaning that the real unemployment rate was 42.9%, not 5.5%. Now, even if you break that back down to actual numbers, if only 240 billion hours, and only which means 43% of the labor hours weren't used, well, if you take about 43% out of the workforce, well, now you're talking about 90 million people out of work. 90 million out of that 210 million between the ages of 16 and 68, and actually it's a little bit more, so I think it's the number is 98 million of those 210 million are out of work. And when you translate that into workable hours, that's a 43% unemployment rate, not 5.5%. Isn't it funny how the government can play loose with numbers? But you and I, if we play loose with our numbers, usually what you have is usually what happens is you get a letter from the IRS telling you, well, you've played loose with these numbers, so we're going to audit you. That's the truth. That's what happens. So you are not allowed to play loose with your numbers. But the government can play loose with their numbers that they're reporting to you all the time, and that's perfect. And if you demand that they be truthful with you, well, then they look at you like you're subservient, and that somehow you're inferior and a rabble rouser, and you need to be reined in. And again, they'll sick the IRS on you. That's just the way it is. Now, I realize this is probably something that most of you have never, heard put that way before. And frankly, I have heard this before. And back during the 80s, during the Ronald Reagan era, these numbers began to reverse. And what do I mean by that? Well, like under Bush, the unemployment rate was down below 4%. Now, at some particular point, I think at 4.3 or 4.5% is statistically considered to be full employment. In other words, everybody that wants a job at 4.5% has one, and the unemployment rate was lower, meaning that if you were actually to translate that into labor hours, that there were actually being produced more labor hours than there were laborers, which means that that's when you started to need certain legal immigration in order to fulfill that gap. So if the number of hours was 420 billion based on 210 million adult Americans, the actual return is that there was 500 billion hours being worked out of a potential 420. Well, you had 80 billion hours more. So what does that mean? That means that there had to be a number of legal immigrants on work visas that had to be brought into the country in order to make up that 80 billion labor hour shortfall, which gives you the whole point of why there was, and anybody who wanted a job basically under Reagan and George W. Bush had one. Look, I remember on George W. Bush, you went into the newspaper and it was page after page after page after page of, in the help wanted section. And it just wasn't general labor either. It was medical professions. It was office help. It was skilled labor like lathe operators and machinists and welders. It was just, it was job upon job upon job offer. And if you wanted a job, you went to the newspaper every Sunday. That's when the all the daily papers have their Sunday papers, and that's when the biggest help wanted section happen, and it was a separate. I remember the Boston Globe was just. It was a good 10 pages of help wanted ads. And that was the same thing back in back under Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush for a while. I mean, it was insane. There were more jobs than there were workers. Literally. Now, today, not only do we have like 98 million people who aren't even counted in the labor force anymore, they're just out of it. But the government has also stopped counting the number. So if you actually look at the number of jobs that were available back under, let's use this easy math number so you understand it. Say that this country had 200 million jobs. It filled and unfilled. There was a pool of 200 million jobs. Now, under Obama and the recession that he did not recover from, out of that 200 million, we lost jobs. Now, granted, yeah, some of that came, at the end of Bush's term, but let's face it, most of it came under Obama. And so now, instead of 200 million jobs that they're counting in this labor pool, they're only counting 130 million jobs. Well, where did the 70 million go? Well, poof. They're gone. Well, wait a minute. We had 70 million that just went bye-bye. Those could still be here if we had a decent and sane domestic economic policy. Yeah, it could be. And therefore, but if those were still here and available, well, that means that the unemployment number would be even higher. If you take those numbers into account, yes, it would be. Because our government is playing fast and loose with the numbers in order to make it look good for Obama. Now, I am not an economist, but I understand these numbers. They're not hard to understand. Now, we can all argue the nuances about why this happened. The point is that it did happen. It happened under the watch of the Obama administration, under Obama's policies. And we're seeing this being manipulated under Obama in his administration, being handed out and meted out to us on a daily basis. We're being fed a bunch of manipulated half-truths. Plain and simple. The economy, folks, really still sucks. And it's not something that you and I can change on a whim because, look, I always tell people, you know what? If you have to be in this type of position. If they throw a recession, you just have to refuse to participate. You have to do everything within your power to refuse to participate. If that means upping your skills and your education level, do it. If that means starting your own business, do it. If it means getting a second or even a third job, part-time job, do it. Just don't participate. Don't sit back and whine, waiting for a compromise, because a compromise means you're not going to get a job. Plain and simple. A compromise means that, we're going to get some people jobs. Other people, well, you're on your own. Well, is that a fair compromise to you? I mean, I don't think it's really fair. You can't, when you have an unemployment rate of 40% or even, in the teens, that's just awful in a country that has the ability not to have it. in a country with an ability to have a 5%, true 5% unemployment rate. But instead, we're being fed a bill of goods and a bunch of lies. Plain and simple. We'll be back.